Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Clown Spirit Podcast. It's wonderful to have you here. Thanks for listening. This week is going to be one of those weeks when I just ramble. I'm not interviewing anyone, talking to anyone. I'm just exploring the world of clowning. And you'll have to forgive me because sometimes these ramblings are organized and structured, and sometimes they're more just like rambles on a topic. And they're a journey that I'm discovering in the moment. In fact, I had the idea for this particular podcast while I was just driving in my car, and I switched on the voice recorder on my phone and left a very rough version of these thoughts that was really rambling and a little bit too spontaneous, too fragmentary to be able to actually use as a podcast. But when I got home, I ran the recording through a transcription software, and then I was able to use AI to reduce that down to some pattern or some outline. And then I messed around with that outline to make it make more sense to me, to elevate certain points, to frame it and structure it in a way that I thought would be more meaningful and more helpful. And that's what I have in front of me right now. There is some rhyme and reason to this, but I don't think it's perfect. I think it's still somewhat rambling, going down certain rabbit holes, and just kind of asking you to go with me and follow me on a journey into my own mind. So if that appeals to you, if that sounds interesting to you, then please listen on. The topic at hand is a big one. I'm hearing a lot now, people saying, clowns can save us. We need clowns right now more than ever. I've been saying this, a lot of teachers and people are saying this kind of thing. And yeah, I love that idea, but I also want to explore how and why and put some flesh on those bones of that claim. So one of the things that I think makes clowning so powerful is that when we're clowning, we are in a space of transformation, collective transformation to be precise. Clowns can get together, and even just individually on their own with an audience, they can catalyze transformation and change on a collective level. And the how of how they do that is what I want to explore today. And in particular, what can happen as a result of their certain abilities clowns have that allow them to engage in that transformation, but that also present a challenge or a risk, a danger. Let me begin with a story from my own clown training, and then I'll get to explaining exactly what I mean by all of this. I want to open with this story because I think it just really helps to illustrate the point in a more graphic, visual way. When I did my first clown training with Sue Morrison, called Clown Through Mask, back in 2001, in those days, we did an exercise that was called Return to Childhood. Now, Sue Morrison's workshop involves, any Clown Through Mask workshop, or whoever it's taught by, usually involves making 6 masks, and for each mask, you are discovering 2 facets of your clown, one of which we call experience, and the other we call innocence. The Return to Childhood exercise is an exploration of the innocence. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with actual concept of innocence. It's just a word. But if you were to walk into the workshop studio during that exercise, you could be forgiven for thinking that this room is full of crazy people pretending to be children, running around, playing, fighting, squabbling, crying, yelling, freaking each other out, being sweet and loving, and all the extremities of human experience. But maybe more explicit, more visible than we would normally expect from adults. Each of those clowns in that space is distinct, different, unique, like a person, but writ large, so beautifully defined, sharp edges, it's very clear. But slowly over time, because this exercise really goes on for quite a long time, maybe an hour or more, something starts to happen over time, which is that some of those clowns start to lose that individuality, that sharp-edged quality. They start to merge into a sort of diluted generality. Their spark dims, their gestures and words lose that definition, and they get absorbed into the energy and rhythm of other clowns who are holding strong in their distinctiveness. When this happens, and it happens to everybody at some point, I think, it certainly happened to me, Sue, as the teacher, would identify, would acknowledge it, and would ask us, maybe come over to an individual or maybe just generally to the room and say, don't lose your essence. Don't let it get washed away, diluted. Stay strong in who you are. Remember who you are when you encounter others. Because this is the problem. When we encounter others, sometimes those others are so strong that we lose ourselves. We dilute and flatten who we are as clowns, or maybe as humans, and we become subsumed, immersed, consumed by the other. Because that, for some reason, that energy draws us in and starts to erode our distinctive uniqueness. Maybe this is striking a chord with you. Of course, it's not just clowning, it's in life that this happens. But there's something about clowns that makes this rather a problem, because clowns are particularly open. It's that openness, that vulnerability that lets clowns connect so deeply with each other and with the audience. But it's also that very openness that can lead to this sort of disappearance. So it's a little bit of a paradox. The quality that makes clowning so powerful and transformative is also the quality that can lead to their disappearance, their dissolution in this sea of other clown energy or other life. That paradox isn't just the central challenge of clowning, it's also what makes clowning essential to this moment in history. So this brings me back to my first point, how clowns can act as guides through transformation. We're living in a time of profound collective transformation, ecological, political, spiritual. There's transformation that we see as good and transformation that we see as bad. Old certainties are breaking down, new patterns are forming, and I think that many of us would like to be part of that process, have more impact on that formation of new patterns. We need people, therefore, who can navigate uncertainty with presence, compassion, and humour. That's what clowns do. They inhabit change, they model adaptability, they bring empathy into chaos. But those same qualities that make clowns such powerful agents of transformation also put them at risk. As I said before, the risk of losing their centre in the process of transformation. Let me talk a little bit more about this. The clown's art is fundamentally collaborative, much more so than most other art forms. Artists of many kinds can exist in isolation. They can create their art in isolation. Then the encounter with the viewer, with the audience, happens later, often when the artist isn't even present. But clowns work in groups, maybe with other clowns, or maybe with the ringmaster or ringleader, with the world, with the audience. Even when performing solo, a clown is never alone. Every moment is a dialogue. Much more so than most performers and actors, clowns are in dialogue with the audience. That's what makes clowning so different and unique and specific, is that the audience feels that the clown is seeing them, hearing them, that the performance is emergent, that the performance is co-created. So even when performing solo, a clown is never alone. Every moment is a dialogue. And this requires a skin that is open, listening, and responsive. That openness is our gift as a clown, but it's also our most dangerous temptation. Something else that Sue often says about clowns is that they live with their nerve endings on the outside of their skin, just waving around in the air. That's what makes us so sensitive. Whereas most people keep their feelings and thoughts on the inside, safely packed away, mostly invisible, clowns live that inner life on the outside, constantly transmitting and receiving information fluidly, full transparency, full permeability. This makes clowning a form of emotional truth-telling, but it also makes us vulnerable to losing definition, losing that sharpness of clarity, vulnerable to being shaped entirely by the energies around us, which is what's happening with those clowns in the exercise, Return to Childhood. They're losing their definition because they're being swallowed up by the other energies all around them. When that happens, the art flattens, it's diluted, and we become reactive instead of creative. Let me repeat that. We become reactive instead of creative. Another way of putting this is that when a clown isn't anchored in a strong sense of who they are, they become pure mirror. Instead of a voice, they become like a vessel, an empty vessel, in which the audience can place its own feelings and thoughts. Now, this may be very affirming for an audience, very enjoyable, in fact, and comforting, but it's not transformative, because each audience member is simply seeing themselves reflected back. There's nothing there to challenge them. There's no dialogue. There's no conversation. It's just them with them. Clowning, like all art, requires encounter to occur. It requires dialogue. And that requires difference and contrast. Something distinct enough to meet the world and be changed by it. So this dissolution that happens sometimes in clowning is the opposite of that connection and transformation. It's a kind of disappearance into that primordial ooze, that generality of the world. And it may be entertaining, but it's not transformative. So the work becomes not just about feeling everything, which is definitely a part of clowning, and it's something that in workshops we are often taught how to do, to sense, to feel, to listen, to become that kind of permeable, transparent being. But we also have to know who is doing that feeling. Who is the clown? Who are you? And we have to learn to be defined in that, and to have resilience and stamina to sustain it. This, in fact, is true of all art forms. I believe that an artist needs to cultivate a clear, recognizable voice, something that carries through all their work. Otherwise, the conversation between self and audience just collapses into imitation and reflection. The clown's task is to discover that voice, not in isolation, but through interaction. Think about a painter or a musician. It's easy for a painter to create something that a viewer wants to see, and maybe will buy and put in their living room because it reminds them of some old memory. It stirs up something in them, some nostalgia, makes them feel something to see it. But really all that's doing is it's providing space for that viewer to have a feeling that's already present for them. It's just reinforcing something that's already there. For me, this isn't really what art should be about. I don't want to get into a debate of what is art and what isn't art. But for me, the artist's work is to bring forward a perspective, a voice, something that's distinctive, a proposition. that the viewer meets and encounters because it's sharp and clear and different. And that friction of difference is what generates the transformation. It's art as dialogue, a living conversation between two full presences that are meeting in their full presence, their full being. So that's what actually makes clowning one of the hardest and most necessary art forms, because it is innately so open. It demands total openness and self-awareness simultaneously. That transparency that makes it powerful also makes it potentially even more open to this muting, this dulling down of distinctiveness, and this loss of true encounter and conversation. So, staying centered in the storm is the challenge for the clown. And as I said before, unlike most artists, clowns don't create in solitude. They always have other people around them, whether it's in a workshop, on stage, maybe if they're working in a cabaret or a circus. Clowns are often involved in the transition, so they're constantly interacting with other artists of different kinds, maybe with the ringmaster or ringleader, definitely with the audience. Their bread and butter is their ability to interact. And so whilst they're doing that, it's especially difficult to maintain that essence, because they're constantly in spaces where there's a lot of different energies being thrown towards them. And it's very easy for them just to become this empty vessel. One of the cool things about the exercise that I mentioned earlier, Return to Childhood, and this mask work in general, is that it's a training ground for exactly that. Learning to not become invisible, but to remain visible, to remain sharp and clear in who you are, to be responsive, but also to be creative, proactive inside that whirlwind of connection. It's not about resisting the current necessarily and going in the opposite direction. It's about learning how to swim in a particular direction without losing yourself. So there's a dynamic balance that's required here in holding shape as a clown. There's a paradox. We have to be porous and yet grounded. And true clowning lives in that balance between the offering and the receiving, the giving and the taking. The clown steps forward with a clear impulse. We make a proposition when we step out onto stage. We have to bring something. But we also have to be open to the moment, to being altered by what comes back. That's where transformation happens for performer and audience alike. This is where the audience doesn't just get to project their thoughts and feelings into us as clowns, as empty vessels, but rather gets to experience an encounter, a meeting with something that's different, that maybe challenges them in a way that might not always feel good. So clowning isn't always about making an audience feel good in that way that the painting I mentioned earlier that kind of brings this nostalgia, makes us feel good. The equivalent for clowning, I think, is when clowning just becomes about entertainment and laughter and comedy. Maybe in that comedy we see ourselves reflected back, and there's something just cathartic about that that's pleasurable. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying I think there's a place for that. But for me, my personal interest is in this element of transformation. And I think that doesn't happen until the audience actually confronts something or encounters something that feels uncomfortable, that feels different, a little bit of tension, friction. There's something that's shifted when they leave. That their settled conventional way of seeing the world has been shifted. The corner of the rug has been lifted, and it doesn't quite feel like the world is as secure under their feet anymore. So to do this, clowns need to hold their shape. And that capacity to hold shape is challenging for a clown because they can't just sit in a studio and create and figure out their identity, what it is they want to express, and then just channel it into a painting or whatever. They have to hold their shape in the interaction, in the moment of dialogue and conversation. Now, this capacity to hold shape in motion, in conversation, isn't something that just happens spontaneously. I think that it's the fruit of steady, intentional practice. It's a muscle. And that's what Sue was working with us on in that exercise. Among other things, what she demands in her work, and what many clown teachers demand, is that ability, that muscle, that resilience and stamina to maintain that shape. And it comes through practice, through discipline. Freedom, in this sense, for a clown, isn't the absence of structure, it's the mastery of structure. Clown craft gives us the foundation to respond authentically in the moment. And practice is how we learn to stay ourselves, even as we open to the unknown. I'd like to propose a recipe of 3 elements that I think are particularly important when it comes to this idea of holding our shape as clowns. I think if all these 3 things are present in your clown practice, it's going to make it a lot easier. Perhaps another way of putting it is that these 3 areas are where you need to focus on holding shape. The first is perhaps the most obvious. The thing that we discover in those clown workshops, the essence of who you are as a clown. That can only come, I think, or at least it's initiated through some kind of training experience. It can occur in performance itself, and certainly some people discover their clowns without any kind of training or initiation, just from being in front of the audience. But I think for many people, some kind of training experience that's a modern day equivalent of initiatory rites of passage that young people would have gone through in indigenous cultures, and sometimes still do. The workshop kind of mimics this. We have to go through something, pass through something that's often very challenging. It's in a group context, and yet a big part of it is individual on our own. And there's a teacher, a mentor, or an elder who is helping us through that process. The second element is that when we actually come to produce material that we're going to perform, that there's a kind of depth of research, kind of integrity in the content and the research that goes into creating and generating material. Maybe it's a story or a myth or a historical event or a current event or something else. But there's a kind of creative process that allows us to explore the content that is not just who I am as a clown, but the thing that I want to express and the medium through which I'm going to express that. The third area is perhaps the most important, and that's time in front of an audience. There is really no substitute for this in terms of building the muscle that allows us to sustain shape over time. We have to spend time in front of an audience, and that can be in a workshop, because you can be in front of audiences in a workshop setting, but it's harder when the audience is out of your control, not in a workshop setting, but in a street or in a circus or a theatre. There's going to be a lot of failure that happens, especially early on. You're going to find that clown shape, that distinctive persona, and the clarity of what it is you want to express start to get diluted and washed out through the presence of an audience, because it's so powerful. And our desire to please the audience is so great that we'll do almost anything, or we'll just run away and withdraw. Being our truest self is very challenging in front of an audience, being the clown. And that's going to take time and practice. So those are the 3 elements I would identify. The initiation, the discovery of your clown, that is, and then the depth of research that you undertake in the creating of material, and then finally the time in front of an audience that really helps you to just grow that muscle through failure to the point where gradually you get stronger and more confident and more clear and more able to sustain your shape and your edges when you're actually playing in front of a crowd. This, as you may have figured out by now, is not just about clowning. It's not just a lesson for clowns. It's a lesson for everyone navigating life, but particularly in this hyper-connected age that we live in. I think even 50 years ago or centuries ago, staying true to yourself in some ways was a less complex task because we came into contact with fewer influences, fewer ideas, fewer people. The way that the information age, and now this age of hyper rapid communication through social media, through the internet, and now the evolving of AI, has created an additional challenge. We live in a sea of interaction, a confusing one. We are all living in that metaphorical world of return to childhood. We're all there in Sue Morrison's studio, those clowns running around playing. Social media, AI, constant connectivity has made our lives one vast improvisation, a continuous exchange of energies and identities. And it's never been easier to give in to those energies, to merge, to mimic, to disappear, to lose who we are. Just think of when we create an identity or an avatar for ourselves on social media and how easy it is just to start to shape that into an ideal self that is conforming and shaped by how everyone else seems to come across to us in the ether. Those things are partly social constructs, and they are also shaped by people in power who control those media that we use to communicate. And when we start to merge and mimic and disappear, we're giving away our power. We're losing control to those media, to those forms, and ultimately to those people who control them. The power, the pressure to please, to adapt, to be liked in the world. It's the same force that makes clowns lose their shape and dilute their truest self. When we vanish into the collective, we lose not only our individuality, but also our capacity to truly serve the collective. Being group-minded, being collective-minded, doesn't mean to just give away our sense of distinctiveness and difference to become like everybody else. It means becoming even more conscious of who we are, our strengths and weaknesses, our distinctiveness, and then bringing that into the collective in conversation with others who are equally distinct and sharp in who they are. What this all ultimately means is that this idea, this learning to hold our shape, isn't just an artistic practice, it's actually a spiritual one. And this is what's so beautiful about clowning. I think it actually, as we learn to clown and we train in clowning, we're undertaking a spiritual training, a spiritual practice that's making us as humans more able to serve the collective, to lead perhaps in this transformative moment we find ourselves in. So clowning becomes a model for human interaction and human wholeness. Clowns show us how to stay open without dissolving, how to meet the world fully without disintegrating, without just becoming the world. And in that balance between surrender and selfhood, between listening and leading, between reacting and creating, we discover the possibility of true transformation. And I think that's what the world needs most from us clowns right now. Not more certainty or more control, but the courage to remain fully ourselves, to surrender to a process of discovery, who we are, a commitment to active exploration and development of expressive forms, and time with other people, social interaction. Even as everything around us changes, we need to learn how to hold our shape and be willing to evolve. I hope that you could follow my train of thought there. I'm not sure that it was super clear, but this is an evolving idea. Maybe I'll return to it in a few weeks or months and see if I can clarify it a little bit more. I feel that there's something there of importance that I really want to articulate, something that does make sense. I'm just not sure if I've found the words to articulate it most effectively just now. I'd love to know what you think. Please do leave a review or a comment. Tell me your take on this. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have a slightly different perspective? Different angle, nuance? Or maybe you just think I'm crazy, or maybe you didn't understand a word of it. Please tell me. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love for this podcast to be as interactive as clowning is, and for this to be a conversation in which I can learn and you can learn, and together we can evolve. Thanks again once more for listening to the Clown Spirit podcast. It's really awesome to think of you listening in your home or in your car or walking along, wherever it is, listening to these musings about clowning. If you have any thoughts about other people you'd like me to interview, let me know. In the meantime, subscribe, write a review, share it with your friends, and go out and clown. Thanks for listening. See you next time.